This is a video on Kant's moral philosophy called Deontology. First, just a little background about the philosopher Kant himself. He was a German philosopher living in the mid to late 1700s. Although he was a German philosopher, he did live in a town that is in present-day Russia. He is considered one of the most important philosophers, particularly for the modern era. He was a professor at a university and was just living his life as a professor when he was struck by the work of another philosopher named David Hume. And he was so disturbed by Hume's philosophy that he felt compelled to develop his own theories to sort of correct the record and demonstrate the falsehood of Hume's claims. Central to all of Kant's philosophy, including his ethics, is the idea that we ought to develop our understanding of the world and of ethics based upon pure reason. That we should work out what we can know a priori before experience. Essentially, the idea is that we should be as rational as possible. We should try to divorce ourselves from our particular contexts as much as possible, with the goal of having whatever results from our investigations be something that can be true for all people at all times, regardless of context, because it was developed through pure reason. With respect to this particular work we're talking about, his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant says that his goal is to seek and establish the supreme principle of morality, the single principle by which we can understand what is moral, what is immoral, regardless of context, through pure reason. For Kant, this single principle will be the categorical imperative. Kant's philosophy is called Deontology. He's not the only deontologist, but he's the most important one, generally speaking. Deontology comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty. And so all deontological theories are duty-based theories, which focus on your moral duty or your moral obligation. For Kant, this is particularly the case with respect to motive, that we must be motivated by our duty, our moral obligation, not by our character or the consequences of our actions. So Kant starts out his investigation, like many philosophers do, with a discussion of the end or the goal or the good of the human being. He agrees with many other philosophers that this end or good must be complete, self-sufficient, good in itself. But he disagrees with many who view the highest end, the good of the human being, as happiness. Instead, Kant says that reason is not particularly suited to happiness. Often people who are the most rational, who live their lives in that particular way, are not very happy, right? Because, they understand the problems that the world has, they understand the shortcomings of people, and that doesn't lead to a particularly happy life. But he says, reason is the most important function of the human being, so whatever it is to be the end, the goal of the human being, should be in line with reason. Well, if it's not happiness, what is it? And he decides that it must be the good will. So he says, on page 7 of the reading that we use for this class, reason's proper function must be to produce a will that is good in itself, and not good as a means. So the idea here is that the ideal human life is going to be a life of a person who has a good will. This isn't the sort of goodwill towards others that you hear in like Christmas songs. It's not about fellow feeling. Instead, it's about having a will, the part of the intellect, or for some people the soul, that has to do with decision making, which is good, which makes good decisions. And according to Kant, a good will is going to be a will which is motivated by duty, rather than happiness or pleasure or something like that. And so this focus on duty leads Kant to enumerate several propositions of duty or propositions of morality. The first of which is, where am I? Yeah, from page 9, that for an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. So the idea here is, if we want to be able to say that an action is moral, that it has moral worth, instead of being just morally neutral, neither moral nor immoral, that action must result from duty. We must do that action because it is our duty to do it. Any other motivation is not going to be sufficient for morality, according to Kant. So another way of putting this is that it must be done from duty, not merely in accordance with duty. It's not enough that it's the right thing to do, we also have to do it for the right reason, namely because it's our duty. Kant gives us 2 examples in the groundwork to support this position. The first is his grocer example. So he says, imagine you have a grocer who is charging people honest prices, right? He's not price gouging, he's not charging different people different prices. But he might have several motivations for doing that. If he's motivated by the fact that it makes him happy to be honest, that's not a moral action. It's good, it's the right thing to do, but it doesn't have moral worth. It's not, or moral content. It's just good. If he is being honest because he's afraid that if he gets caught he'll be fined, he's still not motivated by duty, and so that action still doesn't have moral worth. But if the grocer is motivated to be honest in his pricing because he knows that he has a moral duty to be honest, and he wants to live in accordance, to act because of that duty, even if he knows, maybe he could get away with it, maybe he can make a little bit more money, but no, he has to live in accordance with these moral obligations, he has to act because he has these moral obligations, then that action has moral worth, because he is motivated by duty. He's not just doing the right thing, but he's motivated by his moral obligations, right? The other example that Kant uses is the person who chooses to preserve their life. He says, if you have a person whose life is going awesome, and everything is great, and so they choose to stay alive, he says that's good, that's the right thing to do to preserve your life, but it's not particularly moral because they're motivated by the fact that they're happy, that things are going well. On the other hand, he says, if you have a person who's in despair, who is suffering, and who is considering perhaps ending their life, but instead they choose to preserve their life just because they know they have a moral obligation to preserve it, just because they know that it would be immoral of them to end their life. That person's action of preserving their life has moral worth, because it's not just the right thing to do, but they're also motivated by their moral obligation, by their duty to preserve their life. Right? So the idea here is that there's a distinction between doing just the right thing, acting in accordance with duty, and doing the right thing because it's right, acting from duty. His second proposition of morality, or second proposition of duty, states that an action that is done from duty doesn't get its moral value from the purpose that's to be achieved through it, but from the maxim that it involves. So the idea here is an action gains its moral value not because of your goal, not because of the consequence that you might achieve, but only from the fact that it's your duty to do it. An action is moral not because of its results, its consequences, but because it is the result of a properly understood moral obligation. The big takeaway point here is that for Kant, consequences do not matter. In Deontology, the only thing that matters is that something is your moral obligation. The consequences that result from acting in accordance with your duty do not matter at all for Kant. This is distinct from other philosophical theories, for example, utilitarianism or consequentialism, where consequences are all that matter. Kant says no, consequences don't matter at all. The only thing that matters is what your duty is, what your moral obligation is. And finally, his third proposition of duty states that to have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for law. The law here being the moral law, not any particular legal code. The idea here is that our moral duty, our moral obligations, result not from some inclination we have, not from the consequences the action might have, but from the moral law. A law which exists, which is totally objective, and which, according to Kant, we can discover through reason. Right. So this is not a law that we make up, that might be different in different societies or different cultures or something like that. This is the single moral law that exists for all people at all times, that we can know with certainty through reason. According to Kant, this moral law is the principle he calls the categorical imperative. And so, to have a good will is to act from duty. To act from duty is to act in accordance with the categorical imperative. But what we might ask is that categorical imperative? Well, Kant gives us this information here. He gives several different, what are normally called formulations of the categorical imperative. We're going to focus on only a couple. This first one, he gives a kind of negative statement and a positive statement. So this first formulation of the categorical imperative states that I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. If we want the more positive statement of this formulation, we have that on page 24. Act as though the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Essentially what this means is you should only act if you can will that everyone act that way. Something is moral if you can rationally, logically want everyone to do that same thing. Right? And so when we're trying to figure out whether we ought to act or not, whether some particular action we're thinking about taking is moral or not, all we have to do is use the categorical imperative and determine, can I will that this be a universal law of nature? Can I wish that everyone act this way? And he thinks when we apply this imperative, we arrive at a set of duties. Perfect and imperfect duties. Right. So the idea here is, right, we apply the imperative, the categorical imperative, and we reveal either that an action is immoral, if it violates the categorical imperative, if we see that we could not actually will that someone do that, there's some sort of logical contradiction or something like that, or we see that the action could be universalized and so it would be moral. Kant breaks down these duties that result from the proper application of the categorical imperative into perfect and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are absolute moral requirements. There is never a case where it is morally acceptable to violate a perfect duty. No matter the consequences, no matter what else might be going on, a perfect duty is perfect. It is always the case that it would be immoral to violate a perfect duty. And we'll get some examples in a second. The imperfect duties, on the other hand, allow for some variation. When we have an imperfect duty, we see that, generally speaking, we should promote that duty. That whenever possible, people should live in accordance with these imperfect duties. However, There might be times where it's not possible to fulfill an imperfect duty, and we wouldn't consider people immoral in those instances. Right? So they don't have the sort of absolute nature of the perfect duties, but they are still important. They ought to be promoted in society and in ourselves as much as possible. The idea, in particular with perfect duties, is that transgressing a duty leads to a contradiction in our own will. It's not that we don't think that the duty is important, it's just that we try to make exceptions for ourselves. And Kant wants us to understand that whenever we try to make an exception for ourselves, we're contradicting ourselves. On the one hand, we're saying, oh, this is what morality is, and on the other hand, we're saying, but maybe just this once, I could be immoral, but people shouldn't judge me for that. He says, that's a bit crazy. That doesn't quite work. That's not very logical. Right? If something is moral, it ought to be moral all the time, and you shouldn't be allowed to make an exception for yourself. So we have these perfect and imperfect duties, and Kant gives us some examples for each to try to clarify what these sorts of duties are and how the categorical imperative can help reveal these duties to us. So first he gives us a couple of examples of perfect duties. He says we have perfect duties to ourselves, and we also have perfect duties to other people. His example of a perfect duty to ourselves is that we have a perfect duty to not commit suicide. And he says, I think this is around page 24 if you are using our translation. Imagine you have a person who is in despair and so is considering suicide, but still they have their wits about them enough to wonder if it would be moral. And so they say, well, I know when I'm trying to figure out if something is moral or not, I'm supposed to apply the categorical imperative and see if I can universalize what I want to do, universalize my maxim, as he says. So let me try to do that. Right? And he says, can you universalize the maxim that out of a sense of self-love, to spare yourself increased pain, you can end your life? And he says no. That when you try to universalize that maxim, when you try to say everyone should do this, you realize that it's logically impossible to will that everyone, out of self-love, take their life. Because, he says, the self-love is supposed to be a life-affirming principle. And so there's a contradiction when this principle that's supposed to be life-affirming is also death-affirming. In addition, you might think of it in a less complex way of, if you're willing that everyone do this, soon enough, you're going to have a problem with sort of maintaining the species. Life for the human being is not going to be able to continue to function properly if we will that everyone commits suicide when they're in a state of despair. Right. So the fact that we cannot will that everyone do this indicates that we have a duty not to do it. And so we have a perfect duty to ourselves not to commit suicide. His example of a perfect duty to other people is that we have a perfect duty not to lie. So he says here, imagine you have a person who is in need of money. They know that they're never going to be able to pay back a loan, but they also really need this money. And so they decide, maybe I can just lie and promise to pay it back when I know that I won't be able to. Let me see if this would be moral by applying the categorical imperative. Can I universalize my maxim that in order to help myself in a time of need, I can make a promise even if I know I won't be able to uphold that promise? Can I lie to get what I need? Right. And he says, well, when you try to universalize this maxim and say everyone should lie to get what they need, we again run up against a logical impossibility. We see that we have a contradiction here. We can't actually want everyone to lie to get what they need. And this is because, he says, this will result in the lie becoming meaningless. It will no longer be effective. Lies are only effective when we assume that people are telling the truth. So if it becomes moral to lie, if we say everyone should lie whenever they need something that they can't get otherwise, soon enough, no one is going to believe that lie. People are just going to laugh at you If you lie, if you say, oh, I promise I'll pay you back, why would they believe you when it's already established that it's moral to lie in such a case, right? So the idea is, by universalizing the maxim, I end up in a kind of contradiction. And so this indicates that I should not do this thing, that it would be immoral. And so it is always, according to Kant, immoral to lie. This example of lying is one where people often run into trouble. One of the most common arguments that people make against Kant is that, look, sometimes we lie for the greater good. The most famous sort of counterexample that people give is often called the Nazi at your door example. If you're living in Nazi Germany and you're hiding your Jewish neighbors in your basement, and the Nazis come knocking at your door and ask you, hi, do you have any Jews here? According to Kant, you cannot lie to them. And many people think, but that's crazy. I'm trying to save people's lives here. People are going to die if I don't lie. And Kant says, you can't lie. Maybe you can do other things. Unclear. Many deontologists want to say, maybe you can stretch the truth a little bit. Maybe you can, say something that's true, but in a mocking tone so they think you're just kidding. People try various ways to get out of this problem. But Kant says, look, what the Nazi is doing is also immoral. But you aren't responsible for their immorality. Just because someone else is being immoral doesn't mean you have the right to be immoral. Right? That part of what's important about morality is that it ought to be maintained even in dire circumstances, even when it's really, really difficult. And so we must maintain our perfect duties even if the consequences are going to be severe. Because if we become lax in our duties, then soon enough we'll become lax, in less severe areas, and morality will kind of disintegrate. Right? So we have these perfect duties. These are just two examples. He would say there are more. Likely a perfect duty not to steal, for example, or probably not to murder. But he just gives us one of each as kind of an illustration. So in addition to those perfect duties, we have imperfect duties. As we said before, imperfect duties are duties which, all things being considered, we ought to promote, but there's no contradiction with violating a perfect duty. Life isn't going to fall apart. Society isn't going to fall apart. And so we can allow some times when a perfect duty can be violated. So he gives us an example of a perfect duty we have to ourselves, and that is to cultivate our talents. So he says, imagine you have a person who has natural talents that they could cultivate, but they're lazy, they don't want to. Instead, they just want to, hang out and watch some Netflix. He says, well, society's not going to crumble if people don't cultivate their talents. There's no logical contradiction in universalizing this maxim. You could will that no one cultivate their talents and still have a minimally functional society. However, he says, no one who's actually rational would will that, because no one would actually want to live in that sort of society. And also, he thinks, a rational person is going to want to be the best version of themselves possible. And the best version of yourself possible includes cultivating some of your talents. So he says, it's imperfect because there's no contradiction, society won't crumble, but it's still a duty because the rational person is going to want to universalize cultivation of talents as much as they can, as far as they can. Similarly, we have an imperfect duty to be charitable. This is our imperfect duty we have to others. He says, again, imagine a person who is wealthy, has the resources to be charitable, but they don't really want to be charitable. They'd rather keep their resources for themselves. And they say, look, I'm not going to interfere with anyone else. If people can be successful, great. But it's not my job to help other people either. Right? And he says, can you universalize this maxim that you shouldn't be charitable? He says, well, you could. Society can function if no one is charitable. It's not going to crumble. However, it won't be the best version of society. the best version of society is going to be a version where people are getting help if they need it, where people are helping one another so that the society as a whole can flourish. In addition, he says, it's not really rational to will that no one be charitable, because what if you run into a situation where you need charity? Then it won't be there for you. It's more rational to want the charitable structure to be there in case you need it. And so he says, even though we could have a functioning society without charity, the more rational approach would be to encourage charity. And so we have an imperfect duty, all things being considered, to be charitable. There are times when you could violate this duty. For example, if you have nothing to give, it's going to be difficult for you to be charitable. And Kant wouldn't say that you're immoral if you, keep your money so that you can keep a roof over your head. But whenever possible, we ought to be charitable, and we ought to promote charitability in our society. So again, we had the perfect duties, which are absolute moral obligations, and we have these imperfect duties, which are things that we ought to promote as a rule, with some room, so some bit of wiggle room in certain circumstances. So Kant thinks he's given us this first categorical imperative. He's given us some examples of what kinds of moral prescriptions the first formulation institutes for us. And now he takes a bit of a shift before he gives us his second formulation to talk about the human being and what he thinks the human being is. And so he asks here, or he says here, first of all on page 28, suppose there were something whose existence in itself has absolute value. Something which, as an end in itself, could support determinate laws. That would be a basis, indeed the only basis, for a possible categorical imperative. That is, of practical law. There is such a thing. It is the human being. I maintain that man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, and not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. Essentially what he says here is that the human being is unique, the rational being is unique, in that it has absolute value, absolute worth. Another way of putting this, he says, is that the human being has dignity instead of price. Everything that exists, according to Kant, has either price or dignity. When something has price, it can be exchanged one for another, right? When something has dignity, it is utterly unique, it has intrinsic value, it's not exchangeable. And the human being is that sort of thing, a thing with dignity. You can't substitute one person for another, right? Each human being has intrinsic value, absolute moral worth, and so must be treated in a different way than you treat commodities, things which have price. The grounding of dignity, the reason that human beings have this ultimate worth is, he says, because we have autonomy or freedom. We have a free will which grants us this ability to make our own decisions, to be rational, to be free. According to Kant, the ideal human society is going to be what is called the realm of ends, or the kingdom of ends. A society where we recognize that each person deserves to be treated with respect, that each person has dignity or absolute value, where each human being is treated as utterly irreplaceable and given the respect that they deserve as the unique being that they are. And this appreciation for the value of human life leads to this second formulation of the categorical imperative. So here he says, act in such a way as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. Essentially, treat each human being with respect. Each human being is deserving of respect just by being human, regardless of what they do, regardless of what their actions are. If they are human, they deserve this minimal level of respect, to be treated as ends in themselves, never as mere means. And so to be moral is to uphold that respect. Right. So this is called the second formulation of the categorical imperative instead of a new principle, because according to Kant, both of these formulations, the first one based upon universalizing maxims, and this one based upon respect for the human being, are two ways of saying the exact same thing. He thinks this is one principle expressed in two ways. It will always get us the exact same results. It's just kind of two ways of expressing this one principle of morality. So if we return briefly to those four duties that we talked about earlier, the perfect and imperfect duties that we talked about when we talked about the first formulation, we ought to be able to see relatively easily how the second formulation gets us the same place here. So for example, in his suicide example, he would say, with respect to this second formulation, when a person commits suicide, they are not treating themselves with absolute value. They're not respecting their autonomy. They're not respecting their dignity. Instead, they're using themselves as a means to end their suffering or something like that. Right. And so it's a violation of the categorical imperative. When a person lies, they're not treating the person that they're lying to with respect. They're treating that person as a means to achieve their goals rather than as a being of absolute value, absolute worth, who is an end in themselves. Right. Even if the person isn't a good person, even if it's the Nazi at your door, just by virtue of being human, they are deserving of that minimal level of respect to not be lied to, according to Kant. With respect to our imperfect duties, right, cultivating your talents, well, you could still value yourself as a human being without cultivating your talents, but it would be respecting your uniqueness even more to cultivate them, right? You would be treating yourself with even more respect if you cultivate those talents. And similarly, you could refrain from charity without using people. But it's more respectful to be charitable to others and to yourself in case you're ever in need of that charity. And so we have these imperfect duties just like we have these perfect duties. The exact same results, no matter which formulation of the categorical imperative you use. And so as I said, Kant thinks the ideal human society is this realm or kingdom of ends. The idea is, in the ideal human society, we will understand the autonomy and the dignity of the human being, and we will respect each human being appropriately. This will allow us to understand that human beings are unique in our ability to create the moral law. So for Kant, it's not that the moral law kind of exists and you find it. It's not that God has given it to you, like Aquinas might say. But instead, he says, through our actions, we create the moral law. That's why it's so important to act using the categorical imperative, to test our maxims against the categorical imperative before we act upon them, right? Because whenever we act, we are saying everyone ought to do this. This is the moral way to act. And so we have to take that responsibility that we have as human beings seriously. And in the realm of ends, or the kingdom of ends, we will take that seriously. And so it will be the kind of the ideal human condition where human beings are treated as with absolute value, where our ability to create universal law is respected. And so he says, in the realm of ends, each person would understand never to act on a maxim that couldn't consistently be a universal law, and thus to act only so that the will could regard itself as giving universal law through its maxim. In the realm of ends, everyone would be acting from duty, in accordance with the categorical imperative. Everyone will have achieved the good will. And just a little kind of side note here. Kant ends the groundwork with a discussion of freedom and autonomy. He states that the human being has a free will, an autonomous will. He provides some reasons why he thinks that's the case. However, he is upfront about the idea that he can't actually prove that you have a free will. He thinks that the freedom of the will is the sort of thing where there are decent arguments that the will is free, and also decent arguments that it's not free, that it's determined. This is called an antinomy in Kantian philosophy. He gives several antinomies. One of them is with respect to freedom. Essentially, the idea is we can't prove that we're free, but we must be free. If we're not free, then none of this talk about morality makes any sense. We can only talk about what we ought to do if we have the freedom to do it or not. If everything is determined, then it doesn't really matter what's moral and what's immoral. So he says he is going to presuppose this freedom. Assume that we're free, take it as a first principle, and build the philosophy from there, even though he can't prove it, because not only will deontology not work otherwise, but no moral theory will work without presupposing freedom. So this is just a minor point. It's just an interesting bit of Kant here where he admits at the end, after he's given us this whole moral system, that this system is resting upon this presupposition of human freedom. That we have a free will, that we have the ability to act or not act as we see fit. Yeah, so that is the basic outline of Kantian deontology. I think we will leave it there for now.